David had always prided himself on being progressive, the kind of man who didn't let societal expectations dictate his choices. So, when he met Mia, it felt like destiny. She was everything he admired: intelligent, creative, and unapologetically herself. Her presence was magnetic, her laughter infectious. It wasn't just her stunning beauty that captivated him, but her passion for art, her ability to turn everyday moments into something extraordinary. To David, she was like a rare painting, unique and irreplaceable. Mia had hesitated at first. She knew David came from a world far removed from hers. He was an ambitious entrepreneur from a family of privilege, while she was a struggling artist, carving her path in a society that often dismissed her talent and her identity as a black woman. But David had seemed different. He pursued her relentlessly, promising her a love that would rise above the barriers of race, class, and expectation. His words were poetry, his actions tender. When he proposed, Mia believed in the dream he painted, a partnership built on love, respect, and equality. The early days of their marriage were filled with hope and joy. They rented a cozy apartment, and though their schedules were often demanding, David juggling business meetings and Mia immersed in her studio, they always found time for each other. David would sit with her late at night as she worked on her canvases, marveling at the way her hands brought life to colors. Mia, in turn, supported his dreams, attending every presentation and cheering him on through his triumphs. She even helped him with creative ideas for his branding, though she rarely sought credit. But as David's business grew, so did the demands of his social life. Networking dinners, galas, and exclusive parties became a regular part of their calendar. At first, Mia attended these events with him, standing proudly by his side. She quickly noticed, however, that she was often the only black woman in the room. The stares lingered a bit too long. The conversations veered toward patronizing comments about her art, and some guests didn't bother to hide their discomfort. David brushed off her concerns. "You're imagining things," he'd say, "or they're just curious about you, Mia. You're special." She wanted to believe him, but the doubts began to creep in. The turning point came at a friend's dinner party. As they sat around the table discussing art and culture, one of David's business associates made an offhand comment about how impressive it was that someone like Mia could make a living as an artist. The room fell silent for a moment, everyone unsure of how to react. Mia looked to David, expecting him to defend her, to say something, anything to challenge the ignorance. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, forcing a laugh to lighten the mood. The moment passed, but the sting of his silence stayed with Mia. After that, things began to change. David started attending more events alone, always with a convenient excuse. "It's just a small meeting, nothing formal," he'd say, or "You'd be bored. It's all business talk." At first, Mia accepted his reasoning, convincing herself it was temporary. She told herself that David was under pressure, that he'd eventually invite her back into his world. But deep down, she began to feel invisible, like an accessory David could choose to display or hide depending on the occasion. One evening, while they were getting ready for a gala, David came into the room with a sheepish expression. "Mia," he started, hesitating, "I think it might be better if you skip tonight. It's going to be very corporate, and well, you know how these people are. It's just easier if I go alone." Mia froze, the words hitting her like a cold wind. "Easier for who, David?" she asked, her voice trembling. He sighed, avoiding her gaze. "You know I love you, but sometimes it's complicated. These people, they don't understand." In that moment, something shifted between them. Mia had always known the world could be cruel, but she had believed David was her safe place, the one person who would never let society's prejudices dictate his actions. Hearing him say those words felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of the promises they had built their marriage on. David, sensing her hurt, tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. That night, as he left for the gala without her, Mia sat alone in their apartment, staring at the blank canvas in her studio. The dream they had built together suddenly felt like an illusion, and for the first time, Mia wondered if love was enough to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. As she sat there, the realization dawned on her. She had been shrinking herself, dimming her light, to fit into David's world. And maybe it was time to stop. David's career soared to new heights, and with each success came more obligations to attend galas, networking events, and high-profile dinners. He became a regular fixture in elite social circles, shaking hands with investors and rubbing elbows with celebrities. On the surface, he seemed to thrive in these settings, but inside, he was increasingly aware of a gnawing insecurity. Mia, his beautiful and talented wife, was a constant reminder of a world he feared his peers might not understand or accept. Mia, for her part, tried to be supportive. She knew how important these events were for David's business. In the beginning, she joined him, making an effort to fit in despite feeling out of place among the sleek, polished guests who seemed to measure a person's worth by their wealth or connections. Her charm and wit often caught people off guard, but their questions, always veiled in politeness, seemed to probe her differences. "So, where are you from originally?" someone might ask, ignoring the fact that she'd already mentioned growing up in New York. Or, "Your art is so unique. Do you find that it's inspired by your heritage?" As if her work couldn't stand on its own without being tied to her race. David began to notice these interactions too, but instead of standing by Mia, he started to withdraw. He avoided confrontations and became increasingly hesitant to bring her to events. "It's not that I don't want you there," he'd insist. "It's just easier if I go alone. These people are shallow. They won't appreciate you the way I do." His words sounded like reassurance, but they carried an undertone that stung Mia. He wasn't willing to fight for her. The excuses became more frequent. "It's all business talk. You'd be bored," he'd say. Or, "This event is really just for clients. Next time, I promise." Next time never came. Mia found herself sitting at home more often, waiting for him to return from yet another gathering where he was surrounded by people who didn't know she existed. One evening, while scrolling through social media, Mia stumbled across photos from a lavish event David had attended earlier that week. There he was, standing with a group of well-dressed peers, his arm casually draped over the shoulder of a female colleague. The caption read, "Great to catch up with David at the annual gala. One of the sharpest minds in the room." There was no mention of Mia. It was as if she didn't exist in his world. She confronted him that night, holding up her phone. "Why do I have to find out about these things on social media? David? Why am I not there with you?" David, caught off guard, stammered, "It's not what it looks like. It was just a work thing. You know how these events are." "No, I don't, because I'm never there," she shot back. "You've made sure of that." He sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, as if the conversation was exhausting him. "Mia, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. These events aren't about us, they're about business. It's strategic." "Strategic?" Her voice cracked with emotion. "Strategic to pretend you're single? Strategic to hide the fact that you're married to me?" David looked at her, and for a moment, it seemed like he might say something honest. But then his face hardened. "It's not like that. You're being overly sensitive." The words cut deep. Overly sensitive. As if her feelings were invalid. As if the growing void between them was something she'd imagined. Mia didn't respond. She simply turned away, swallowing the lump in her throat and retreating to her studio. The distance between them grew wider with every unspoken word. David began coming home later, often claiming he had meetings that ran long. When he was home, he seemed distracted, glued to his phone, or buried in work. Mia, once the center of his world, now felt like an afterthought. One day, while tidying up the living room, she found an invitation tucked into his briefcase. It was for an exclusive dinner hosted by one of the city's most influential business leaders. The event was marked as +1. Her heart sank. He hadn't mentioned it, hadn't even considered inviting her. When she asked him about it later, he brushed it off with a casual, "I didn't think you'd be interested." Mia's patience was wearing thin. "David, do you even see me anymore? Or am I just the woman you leave at home to keep your image intact?" David avoided her gaze. "Mia, it's not like that. These people, they're complicated. They don't understand us." "Don't understand us?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Or don't understand me?" The conversation ended the way they all seemed to lately, with David deflecting and Mia retreating into her silence. That night, As David slept soundly beside her, Mia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the man she'd married, the promises they'd made, and the love she still felt for him. But she also thought about herself, the woman she used to be before she started shrinking to fit into David's world. For the first time, she began to wonder if she was disappearing entirely, not just in his life, but in her own. Something had to change. She didn't know what that would look like yet, but deep down, Mia knew she couldn't keep living this way. The final crack in Mia's heart came on an otherwise ordinary evening. David had been unusually quiet that week, his schedule packed with back-to-back meetings and an upcoming dinner with potential investors. Mia, ever the supportive partner, had made peace with his busyness. She had even cooked his favorite meal that evening, hoping to share a quiet moment with him before his big night. But when David walked through the door, his demeanor was different, nervous, almost shifty. He avoided her gaze as he set his briefcase down and loosened his tie. "Hey," Mia greeted, her voice soft. "How was your day?" "Busy," he replied curtly. "I've got that dinner tonight. Might run late." Mia hesitated, trying to read his expression. "Do you want me to come with you?" "I could." David cut her off, shaking his head. "It's not necessary. It's mostly work stuff. You'd be bored." It was the same excuse he'd used countless times before, but something about the way he said it felt more final this time. Mia didn't argue, though her chest tightened with the familiar sting of rejection. Instead, she nodded and quietly went back to the kitchen, pretending she didn't care. That night, while David was at the dinner, Mia sat alone in their apartment, trying to focus on her art. But her mind kept wandering, replaying the countless moments David had dismissed her, minimized her, or hidden her. She thought about the woman she used to be, the vibrant, confident artist who wasn't afraid to take up space. Slowly, she realized how much of herself she'd lost in her attempts to fit into David's world. As the hours ticked by, she picked up her phone, scrolling idly through social media. Her heart stopped when she stumbled upon a photo posted by one of David's colleagues. It was a group shot from the dinner he'd attended. David stood at the center, his arm draped casually around the shoulder of a polished, glamorous woman. The caption read, "Great night with the team. Couldn't ask for better company." Mia's stomach churned. It wasn't just the photo, it was what it represented. David didn't just exclude her. He created an image of himself that erased her entirely. She clicked through more photos, and the pattern became clear. He had constructed a version of his life where Mia didn't exist, where he could be the charming, unattached entrepreneur without the complications he claimed she brought. When David returned home later that night, Mia was waiting for him in the living room. Her face was calm, but her eyes were filled with hurt. He stopped in the doorway, his briefcase in hand, sensing the tension in the room. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone cautious. "No, David," Mia replied, her voice steady but cold. "It's not." He set down his briefcase and moved closer, frowning. "What's wrong?" Mia held up her phone, showing him the photo. "This," she said, "this is what's wrong." David's face paled. "Mia, it's not what you think." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice rising. "Don't insult me by pretending this isn't exactly what it looks like. You erased me, David. You're out there living a life where I don't even exist." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "It's not like that, Mia. You're overreacting." "Overreacting?" she repeated, her voice trembling with emotion. "Do you have any idea how it feels to be your wife but feel like your dirty little secret? To watch you parade around like you're single because you're too ashamed to bring me into your world." David opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself. He looked away, guilt etched across his face. "I gave up so much for you," Mia continued, her voice breaking. "I put my dreams on hold. I stood by you through everything. And this is how you repay me? By hiding me? By making me feel like I'm not good enough." David finally looked at her, his expression a mix of regret and frustration. "Mia, you know it's not about you. It's complicated. These people, they don't understand." Mia laughed bitterly, tears streaming down her face. "You're right, David. It's not about me. It's about you. Your insecurities, your fear of what other people think. And I'm done letting that define my life." For the first time, David looked genuinely shaken. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't do this anymore," Mia said firmly. "I can't keep shrinking myself to fit into your world. I've spent too long waiting for you to choose me, to fight for me. But you won't, and I deserve better." David tried to protest, but Mia held up her hand, stopping him. "Don't. You've made your choice, David, and now I'm making mine." That night, while David slept, Mia packed her belongings. She moved quietly through their apartment, her heart heavy but resolute. By morning, she was gone, leaving behind a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. It read, "David, I loved you more than words can express. But I refuse to love someone who doesn't see my worth. I hope one day you realize what you lost. Goodbye." As Mia stepped into the early morning light, a mix of fear and freedom washed over her. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of expectation lift from her shoulders. She didn't know where she was headed, but she knew one thing for certain. She was finally choosing herself. Mia's new beginning started quietly, almost hesitantly. She moved to a small apartment in a lively, artsy neighborhood in a new city where no one knew her name or her past. It was a modest space, just enough for her and her canvases, but it felt like hers, a blank slate where she could start rebuilding her life. The first few days were filled with a strange mixture of liberation and uncertainty. She had walked away from everything she had known, from the comfort of stability, and from a love that had slowly eroded her sense of self. Now, as she unpacked her belongings, it felt like she was also unpacking parts of herself she had long buried. Her art, which had been neglected for months, became her refuge. In the stillness of her new home, she poured her emotions onto the canvas. The pain, the betrayal, the lingering love she couldn't entirely let go of, it all flowed into her work. She painted long into the night, her brushes moving with an urgency she hadn't felt in years. Her first piece was raw and unfiltered, jagged strokes of red and black that felt like a scream on canvas. When she finished, she stood back and stared at it, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Mia's small apartment was surrounded by a vibrant community of artists, musicians, and writers. It didn't take long for her to become a part of it. Her neighbor, an elderly sculptor named Irene, noticed Mia struggling to carry her canvases upstairs one afternoon and introduced herself. Irene invited Mia to a local artist collective that met weekly to share work and ideas. At first, Mia was hesitant, unsure if she was ready to open up to strangers. But Irene's warmth and persistence won her over, and she agreed to attend. The collective was a revelation. It was held in a dimly lit warehouse filled with mismatched furniture, where artists of all ages and backgrounds gathered to critique, encourage, and inspire one another. Mia brought one of her recent paintings, a chaotic blend of colors representing her inner turmoil. As she nervously presented it to the group, she braced for judgment. Instead, the room fell silent, and then one by one, people began to speak. "This is so raw," one person said. "You can feel the emotion in every stroke. It's like you're telling a story," another added. "It's painful but powerful." For the first time in what felt like forever, Mia felt seen. Not as someone's wife or an accessory to someone else's life, but as herself. The collective became her safe haven, a place where she could experiment, grow, and heal. Word about Mia's talent began to spread within the local art scene. One day, Irene introduced her to a gallery owner named Leo, who was known for showcasing emerging artists. Leo was immediately drawn to Mia's work, especially the raw honesty that radiated from her pieces. He offered her a spot in a group exhibition, and though Mia felt a pang of self-doubt, she accepted. The exhibition was a turning point. As people wandered through the gallery, pausing in front of her paintings, Mia stood at the back, quietly observing. She overheard snippets of conversation. "Who is this artist? Her work is incredible." For the first time, she realized her art could speak for her in ways she never could. It was cathartic and validating, a reminder that her voice mattered. The success of the exhibition opened doors Mia hadn't dared to dream about. More galleries reached out, asking to showcase her work. She began receiving commissions, and her pieces sold quickly, sometimes even sparking bidding wars. Critics started to notice her, describing her style as a visceral exploration of identity and resilience. Mia's confidence grew with every step. She no longer felt the need to shrink herself or apologize for taking up space. Her art became a reflection of her journey, not just the pain of her past, but also the strength she found in moving forward. She began to explore themes of self-worth, identity, and the beauty of imperfection. One of her most celebrated pieces, titled Unbroken, featured a cracked vase mended with gold, inspired by the Japanese art of kintsugi. It was a metaphor for how she saw herself, not flawless, but whole. Despite her rising success, Mia remained grounded. She used her platform to mentor young artists, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. She started hosting workshops, teaching others how to channel their emotions into art. In these moments, she found a deeper sense of purpose, knowing she was helping others find their voices as she had found hers. There were still nights when the pain of her past crept in, when she wondered what might have been if David had chosen her as fiercely as she had once chosen him. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. With each brushstroke, each new connection, Mia felt herself letting go of the weight she had carried for so long. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had created. Mia's life had transformed, not because someone had rescued her, but because she had rescued herself. For the first time in years, she felt free, free to be seen, free to be heard, and free to be unapologetically herself. David's life began to unravel slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The morning he woke up to find Mia gone, it didn't feel real. He walked through their apartment, expecting to see her in the kitchen or her studio, but the silence was deafening. The note on the counter stopped him cold. Her words were clear, final, and devastating. As he read it over and over, the weight of what had happened started to sink in. She was gone. At first, David told himself it was temporary. Mia was upset, angry even, but she would cool off and come back. They would talk it out, and things would go back to normal. But days turned into weeks, and the apartment remained empty. The realization hit him like a freight train. Mia wasn't coming back, and it was entirely his fault. Work became his distraction. He threw himself into meetings, presentations, and strategy sessions, trying to drown out the gnawing guilt. But something had shifted. Without Mia, the spark of creativity and intuition that had once set him apart seemed to fade. His ideas felt hollow, his decisions reactive instead of proactive. His team began to notice his irritability, his impatience with small mistakes. The David they knew, the charismatic, composed leader, was unraveling. It wasn't just work. David's social life, once filled with glamorous events and shallow connections, began to feel meaningless. The friends he had worked so hard to impress didn't seem to care that his marriage had ended. In fact, some of them barely acknowledged Mia's absence, as if she had never existed in the first place. Their indifference stung more than he expected. For all the effort he'd put into keeping up appearances, it became glaringly obvious how superficial those relationships were. The real blow came when his business began to falter. A major deal fell through after a key investor pulled out, citing a lack of confidence in David's leadership. It was a domino effect. Other clients followed suit, leaving the company scrambling to fill the gaps. For the first time in his career, David felt the weight of failure pressing down on him. His usual charm and persuasion didn't work this time. He couldn't fake confidence when everything around him was crumbling. At night, alone in the apartment that still held traces of Mia, her favorite mug, a scarf she'd forgotten in the closet, David couldn't escape the memories. He would sit in the living room, staring at her empty studio, haunted by the echoes of her laughter and the quiet hum of her creativity. He began to replay every moment he had dismissed her, every time he had chosen his ego over her. The excuses he had once told himself sounded hollow now. It's just business. She wouldn't fit in. They wouldn't understand. The truth was harsher. He had been ashamed, not of Mia, but of what others might think of him for loving her. He had let his insecurities and fear of judgment dictate his actions, and now he was paying the price. He had lost the one person who truly believed in him, who had stood by him even when he hadn't deserved it. One evening, while sorting through old files, David came across a folder of Mia's sketches. She had given them to him early in their relationship, proud of the concept she was working on. He had kept them but had never really looked at them. Now, as he flipped through the pages, he saw her talent in a way he hadn't before. Each line was precise yet full of emotion, each piece telling a story he hadn't taken the time to understand. Tears welled up in his eyes as he realized how much he had failed to appreciate her, not just as his wife, but as a person with her own dreams and brilliance. He had spent so much energy trying to fit her into his world that he had never stopped to see the beauty of hers. David began to retreat from the social circles that had once defined his life. The parties, the galas, the endless networking, they all felt hollow without Mia by his side. His friends noticed the change in him, but their concern was fleeting. They had their own lives, their own ambitions, and David realized he had been a part of their world only as long as he was useful. For the first time in years, David found himself truly alone. The apartment grew colder, emptier, despite the material wealth that surrounded him. His once impressive business now felt like a house of cards, and he could no longer ignore the glaring truth. He had built his success on shallow foundations, neglecting the things that truly mattered. Late at night, he would sit by the window with a glass of whiskey, staring out at the city lights. He thought about Mia, where she might be, what she might be doing. Was she happier without him? Did she miss him at all? The questions haunted him, but he knew he had no right to the answers. She had given him everything, and he had thrown it away. David's downward spiral wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a slow, relentless unraveling of the man he thought he was. And as he sat alone in the silence, he began to realize that the only way forward was to confront the man he had become and find a way to rebuild. Not to win her back, but to become someone worthy of the love he had lost. Mia's journey into stardom wasn't something she sought intentionally. It unfolded organically, fueled by her relentless dedication and authenticity. After the success of her first group exhibition, her name began to circulate in the art community. She was no longer just a local artist. People were beginning to recognize her work for its raw emotion and unique storytelling. Each painting she created seemed to carry a piece of her soul, resonating deeply with anyone who encountered it. One of her pieces, Shattered Still Whole, caught the attention of an influential art critic during the group show. The painting depicted a fractured mirror with vivid colors bleeding through the cracks, symbolizing resilience and beauty in imperfection. The critic wrote a glowing review, describing her work as a visceral exploration of identity and healing that challenges viewers to confront their own vulnerabilities. That review catapulted Mia into the spotlight. Suddenly, she began receiving invitations to collaborate with galleries, participate in exhibitions, and even commission work for private collectors. Each opportunity felt like validation, not just of her talent, but of the journey she had undertaken to rebuild her life. Yet for Mia, the fame was secondary. Her art had always been deeply personal, a way to process her emotions and reclaim her sense of self. She approached every project with the same sincerity and passion, refusing to let commercial success dilute the authenticity of her work. One day, Mia received an email that made her heart race. It was an invitation to host a solo exhibition at a prestigious gallery in New York City, a dream she hadn't dared to imagine. The gallery's curator, impressed by her recent pieces, wanted to showcase a collection that told her story. Mia was hesitant at first. The idea of bearing her soul on such a grand stage felt both thrilling and terrifying. But after a long night of contemplation, she decided to embrace the opportunity. This was her chance to take ownership of her narrative, to show the world who she truly was. Over the next few months, Mia worked tirelessly on the collection. She poured every ounce of her energy into the pieces, revisiting memories and emotions she had buried deep. Some nights were cathartic, as she painted scenes of hope and resilience. Other nights, she found herself in tears, reliving the pain of rejection and loss. But through it all, she stayed committed, knowing that this body of work was more than just art. it was her truth. When the night of the exhibition finally arrived, Mia stood nervously at the entrance of the gallery. The space was packed with critics, collectors, and art enthusiasts, all eagerly awaiting her arrival. Irene, her mentor and friend, stood beside her, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "This is your moment," she said with a warm smile. As Mia stepped into the spotlight, the crowd erupted in applause. The walls of the gallery were adorned with her paintings, each one a chapter of her story. The centerpiece of the collection was Unbroken, a breathtaking depiction of a vase mended with gold, inspired by the Japanese art of kintsugi. The piece symbolized the beauty of embracing imperfections and finding strength in scars. It quickly became the most talked-about work of the evening, with collectors vying to purchase it. During her speech, Mia shared the inspiration behind her work. She spoke about her journey of self-discovery, her struggles with self-worth, and the resilience it took to rise above the pain. Her voice trembled at times, but her words were powerful and authentic. "For a long time, I let others define my value," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "But I've learned that true strength comes from embracing who you are, flaws and all." That's what this collection represents. By the end of the night, nearly every piece in the exhibition had been sold, and Mia had signed contract for several future projects. The success was overwhelming, but what moved her most were the personal stories people shared with her. A young woman told Mia that her art had given her the courage to leave a toxic relationship. An older man said her work reminded him of his late wife's strength. These moments of connection reinforced Mia's belief in the transformative power of art. As her career continued to flourish, Mia remained grounded. She used her newfound platform to mentor young artists, particularly those from underrepresented communities. She launched a scholarship program to support aspiring creatives, ensuring they had the opportunities she once struggled to find. Through her workshops and speeches, she encouraged others to find their voices and tell their stories. Mia's success wasn't just about fame or wealth. It was about reclaiming her identity and creating a legacy that went beyond herself. While her past still lingered in her heart, it no longer defined her. She had transformed her pain into purpose, proving that even the deepest wounds could give rise to something beautiful. Years later, during an interview with a prominent magazine, Mia was asked what motivated her to keep creating. She smiled thoughtfully before responding, "Because there are so many people who need to be reminded that they matter. If my art can do that for even one person, then it's worth everything." Mia had risen above the shadows of her past, not by forgetting it, but by using it to illuminate her future. David arrived at the high-profile networking event feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. His company was on the brink of collapse, and this evening was critical to securing new investors. The grand ballroom buzzed with energy, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the hum of quiet conversations. David straightened his tie, plastered on his most confident smile, and prepared to charm his way through the evening. As he scanned the room, he noticed clusters of people gathered near an installation at the far end of the hall. A crowd formed, their expressions animated and reverent. Curious, David made his way closer, catching snippets of conversation. "She's incredible. Her story is just as powerful as her art," one person murmured. "I've never seen anything like it," another added. David's interest peaked, though he couldn't quite understand the excitement. The name on the banner above the installation hit him like a lightning bolt. Mia Sinclair, A Journey in Color and Resilience. His breath caught in his throat. Mia. His Mia. For a moment, he froze, the room spinning around him. He hadn't seen or spoken to her in years, though her absence had haunted him every day. He had thought of reaching out countless times, but never found the courage, knowing he had no right to disrupt her life. And now, here she was, not just a part of this world he had fought so hard to fit into, but a shining star commanding its attention. David stepped closer, his heart pounding. The installation showcased Mia's most celebrated works, including the piece that had catapulted her into international fame, Unbroken. It was just as stunning as he remembered from the countless articles and features he had read about her over the years. The golden seams of the vase gleamed under the soft gallery lights, each crack telling a story of pain transformed into beauty. He swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the symbolism and the realization of how much he had underestimated her. As he stood there, a voice rang out, amplified through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming tonight's guest of honor, the extraordinary Mia Sinclair." The applause was thunderous as Mia stepped onto the stage. David's eyes locked on her, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. She looked radiant, her confidence and grace lighting up the room. She wore a sleek, elegant dress that reflected her transformation, not just in style, but in the way she carried herself. This was not the woman he had left behind. This was someone who had risen above everything he had once feared and dismissed. Mia began to speak, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "When I started my journey, I never imagined I would be standing here today. My art was born from a place of pain and self-discovery, but it became something much bigger. It became a way to connect, to inspire, and to remind people that our scars, visible or invisible, don't diminish our worth. They tell the story of who we are." David felt a lump in his throat as he listened. Her words were a mirror, reflecting everything he had failed to see in her when they were together. He had been so consumed by his own insecurities and the opinions of others that he had blinded himself to her brilliance. And now, she stood here, commanding the attention of the very people he had once feared would judge her. After the speech, guests lined up to speak with Mia, to praise her work and share how it had touched their lives. David stood at the back, torn between wanting to approach her and feeling unworthy of even being in the same room. He watched as she greeted everyone with warmth and humility, her smile genuine and her presence magnetic. Eventually, the crowd began to thin, and David found himself standing alone near one of her paintings. He stared at it, lost in thought, until he heard a familiar voice behind him. "David." He turned slowly, his heart pounding. Mia stood there, her expression calm but unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Finally, David found his voice. "Mia," he said softly, You were incredible up there." She nodded, her gaze steady. "Thank you." There was an awkward pause before David blurted, "I've been following your work. It's amazing, Mia. You've achieved so much." Her lips curved into a small, polite smile. "I've been fortunate to find my path." David swallowed hard, the words he had rehearsed in his mind over the years suddenly feeling inadequate. "I owe you an apology," he began. "For everything. For the way I treated you, for not seeing you, truly seeing you for who you are. I was a coward, Mia, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Mia's expression softened, though she remained composed. "I appreciate you saying that, David. It took me a long time to make peace with the past, but I've moved on. I hope you find what you're looking for, too." Her words were kind, but there was a finality to them that David couldn't ignore. He nodded, realizing this wasn't the moment for redemption or reconciliation. It was simply a moment of closure, a chance for him to acknowledge his mistakes and for her to walk away free of them. As Mia turned to join another group of guests, David stood there, watching her go. His heart ached with regret, but also with a strange sense of pride. She had become everything he had once failed to see, and more. For the rest of the evening, David kept his distance, content to admire her from afar. He didn't deserve to be a part of her world anymore, but seeing her thrive gave him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. It was a bittersweet reminder that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone you love is let them go. David paced back and forth outside the gallery, his mind a storm of emotions. The evening had left him shaken. Mia had not only made it, but she had thrived beyond anything he could have imagined. She was everything he had pushed aside, everything he had tried to control and suppress, now standing in front of him as an undeniable force. The realization of how deeply he had wronged her weighed heavily on him. He had let his fears and insecurities blind him to her greatness. And now, as he stood there, the depth of his failure became all too real. The night felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to confront the truth. He couldn't walk away without trying to make things right, even if he knew it might be too late. There was no magic apology that would undo the years of neglect, the years of humiliation he had subjected her to. But he owed her this. He had never truly apologized, not in the way she deserved. His words had always been defensive, excuses wrapped in pride, masking the regret he now felt deep in his bones. Tonight, he would find the courage to do it differently. David took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of humility he had left, and walked back into the gallery. Mia was speaking with a small group of people, her smile bright and genuine, her presence commanding yet warm. He hesitated, watching her for a moment before stepping forward. "Mia," he called softly, and she turned, her eyes meeting his. For a brief second, they just looked at each other. Two people who had once shared everything, now standing in the aftermath of years of silence and mistakes. Mia didn't speak immediately, but her expression was calm, steady, as if she had expected this moment to come at some point. David took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. I need to apologize. Properly this time, he said, his voice raw. I've been thinking about this for years, and I know no words can ever undo the damage I caused, but I need you to know that I am sorry, Mia. Truly. Mia's gaze softened, but she didn't interrupt. She simply waited, her quiet strength giving him the space to continue. I was selfish, David continued, his hands trembling slightly. I was so focused on the world I thought I had to be a part of, the world that judged us, that I lost sight of the one thing that truly mattered, you. I didn't see you for who you really were. I couldn't see past my own insecurities, my own fears. I pushed you away, and I'm sorry. I should have been proud of you. I should have supported you. He paused, swallowing hard as the weight of those words settled inside him. But I didn't, and I'm sorry for that. Mia stood still, her eyes fixed on him, and for a moment, David wondered if she would say something, anything to make the silence feel less suffocating. But instead, she just nodded, as if processing his words, absorbing the truth he had laid bare before her. I was ashamed of us, Mia. Of you, David confessed, his voice shaking now. I was ashamed of how others might perceive our relationship. I thought if I could just blend in with them, if I could just fit in, everything would be easier. I thought it was for the best, but I was wrong. I lost the one thing that made me feel whole. I lost you. Mia's face remained calm, but David could see the flicker of something in her eyes. Perhaps it was pain, perhaps something else, but there was no anger. She had long since shed her anger toward him. That, he realized, was perhaps the greatest tragedy of it all. He had pushed her to a place where she could let go of the bitterness and simply move forward, while he had been left clinging to the regret of his own choices. I was a fool, David continued, his voice steadying. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to welcome me back into your life, because I know that's not something I deserve. But I need you to know that I've changed. I've spent so much time thinking about the man I was and the man I want to be, and I can't undo the past, but I can try to be better moving forward. I just need you to know how deeply sorry I am. There was a long pause, and for a moment, David thought she might walk away, that she might dismiss him as easily as she had dismissed the past. But Mia didn't. Instead, she took a breath, her voice calm and measured. You know, David, Mia began, her tone even. For a long time, I would have given anything to hear you say that. I wanted to hear you admit that you saw me, that you valued me. I wanted to hear you acknowledge how wrong you were. And now here you are. You're finally saying what I needed to hear. David's heart sank as he realized just how much he had missed, how much he had failed to recognize while it mattered. But Mia's next word surprised him. I don't hold on to that pain anymore, she said softly, her gaze unwavering. I don't need your apology to move forward. I needed to move forward for myself, to find my own strength. And I've done that. I've built a life I'm proud of. David's throat tightened. I know, he whispered. I can see that now. I can see you. And I'm so proud of you, Mia. You're incredible. She smiled, a small, knowing smile. Thank you. But this isn't about you anymore, David. It's about me. And in that moment, David understood. He had spent so long wishing for her to forgive him, to give him another chance. but he had never truly seen what she had become. She wasn't the woman who needed his approval anymore. She was the woman who had found her own voice, her own worth. And it was beautiful. "I don't expect anything from you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, that I see you, that I understand now." Mia nodded slowly, her eyes soft but firm. "I know, David, and I appreciate it. But the truth is, I've already forgiven you. Not for you, but for me. It's part of my journey, and I've moved on." David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't the reconciliation he had once hoped for, but it was something more profound, a quiet acceptance, a final letting go. Mia had moved on, and in doing so, she had found peace. And in that peace, so had he. "Goodbye, David," Mia said, her voice gentle but resolute. "I wish you well." As she turned to leave, David watched her go, knowing that he had finally done the one thing that mattered. He had let her go, and in doing so, he had found a measure of redemption. Mia's life continued to unfold in ways she never could have imagined. And yet, there was a peace within her that grew stronger with each passing day. The journey from the woman who had once been hidden in the shadows of someone else's expectations to the confident, celebrated artist she had become was nothing short of transformative. She had not only rebuilt her life, but had created a new narrative for herself. One that was completely hers, untainted by the mistakes and insecurities of her past. After the exhibition in New York, the opportunities that came her way were staggering. She was invited to speak at conferences, to mentor young artists, and to share her story with those who needed to hear it. She was no longer just an artist. She had become an icon, a symbol of resilience and strength for those who had felt invisible, for those who had faced rejection or discrimination. But Mia never let the fame or accolades change her. She remained humble, grounded by the lessons she had learned during her years of struggle and self-discovery. Despite the whirlwind of success, Mia found her true peace in quiet moments. She moved into a larger studio, one that was bathed in natural light and filled with canvases in various stages of completion. This space was hers alone, a sanctuary where she could reflect, create, and most importantly, breathe. She had the freedom to explore new techniques, to experiment with abstract forms, and to dig deeper into her own identity through her art. Every new piece was a further reclamation of her story, a story that was no longer defined by the hurt of her past, but by the strength and growth she had cultivated. It was in this studio, surrounded by her work, that Mia felt truly at home. The world outside her studio was often chaotic, full of demands, expectations, and distractions. But here, in her sanctuary, she found clarity. Her days began to take on a rhythm of their own, a balance between creating, mentoring, and giving back to the community that had supported her from the beginning. Mia also started a foundation dedicated to supporting young women of color who wanted to pursue careers in the arts. She used her platform to ensure that others didn't have to face the same barriers and discrimination she had encountered early in her career. The foundation quickly gained traction, with donors eager to fund scholarships and provide mentorship to aspiring artists. Mia's workshops became a sought-after resource, and she found joy in watching these young women discover their own voices and claim their space in the art world. One afternoon, as she was preparing for a new gallery opening, Mia received a letter from a woman named Sarah, a former student of one of her workshops. The letter was long, filled with gratitude and personal reflection. Sarah had come from a difficult background, struggling to find her place in the world, just as Mia had once struggled. The woman wrote about how Mia's art, her words, and her journey had inspired her to leave an abusive relationship and pursue her own passion for painting. In the letter, Sarah shared that she had sold her first painting in a local gallery, and it was all because of the courage Mia had instilled in her. As Mia read the letter, her hands shook slightly. She had helped so many others along the way, but to see the tangible impact of her work on someone else's life was humbling. It wasn't about the fame or the recognition. It was about giving others the strength to see their own worth, to find their own path. For Mia, this was the true triumph. It wasn't about proving herself to anyone. It was about using her experiences to help others find their light. Despite all the success, Mia never forgot where she had come from. She made it a point to return to her roots, whether by visiting the community she had once lived in or by staying connected to the small artist collective that had first embraced her when she was still a struggling artist. She had a deep sense of responsibility to the people who had supported her journey, and she wanted to ensure that they too had opportunities to thrive. As the years passed, Mia's life found its rhythm, and her art became more personal, more introspective. She began creating larger, more complex works, paintings that explored themes of belonging, identity, and healing. The pieces were deeply emotional, sometimes chaotic, sometimes serene, but always powerful. The Healing of Self, a massive abstract piece that explored the fractured nature of human identity, became one of her most talked about works. It was a culmination of everything Mia had gone through: her pain, her healing, her reclamation of self. One evening, after finishing a new series of paintings, Mia stood in front of them, reflecting on how far she had come. She thought about her journey from that painful day when she had walked away from David to this moment where she had found peace, not in someone else's approval, but in her own heart. She thought about the apology he had offered, about how his words had opened the door to a new chapter in her life, one that didn't rely on his validation or anyone else's. She thought about the woman she had become, the woman who had learned to love herself, flaws and all. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had shaped her into someone she was proud of. Mia had fought for her voice, and in doing so, she had built a life that was hers, truly hers from the ground up. She had closed the door on the past, but she had done so with love, with understanding, and with a deep appreciation for the lessons it had taught her. As Mia closed the door to her studio for the night, she looked out at the city skyline, her heart full. She had found her purpose, her peace, and her power. And for the first time in her life, she felt whole, not because of anything or anyone else, but because she had learned to be whole within herself. The woman who once felt unseen was now a beacon of light for others, and in that, Mia found her true triumph. David's journey toward redemption was neither swift nor simple, but it was one he had committed himself to with a determination born out of painful self-awareness. In the weeks following his brief encounter with Mia at the gallery, he found himself grappling with the full weight of his actions. The pain he had caused her, the way he had distanced himself from the love they once shared, all of it played over and over in his mind. It was as if a veil had lifted, and for the first time in years, he could see himself, truly see himself, without the filter of pride or ego. His business continued to struggle, but David was no longer preoccupied with saving face. The relentless drive to succeed in the eyes of others, to keep up with the shallow social expectations that had once dominated his life, had lost its grip on him. He began to let go of the toxic relationships that had kept him tethered to a world that wasn't truly his. His colleagues, once confidants, no longer held the same importance in his life. Some of them left, disillusioned by his apparent shift in priorities, but David didn't mind. For the first time in his life, he felt a genuine sense of relief at no longer living for others. He also began taking small steps to heal himself. Therapy, meditation, reading about personal growth and emotional intelligence. These were things he had once dismissed as indulgent or unnecessary. But now, they became his foundation. Slowly, he started to understand the roots of his fears and insecurities, the reasons why he had pushed Mia away when she had needed him most. It was a long, painful process, but it was necessary. Each session with his therapist chipped away at the walls he had built around himself, helping him confront the reality of who he had been. Despite the progress he was making, there were days when the regret felt overwhelming. The guilt over how he had treated Mia, the opportunities he had squandered to show her love, were constant companions. He found himself thinking of her often, imagining where she might be and how she had continued to thrive without him. He envied her strength, her ability to move on with such grace, while he was left to pick up the pieces of his life. But even in his moments of despair, there was a glimmer of hope. Hope that he could become a better version of himself. One evening, while working late in his office, David found himself browsing through old files on his computer. He came across a folder titled Mia. It was filled with photos of her from their earlier years together, moments they had shared that he had never fully appreciated at the time. The photos were a stark reminder of how much he had taken for granted. In that moment, David knew that he couldn't keep running from his past. He had to face it head-on, not just for Mia, but for himself. He made a decision. He would find a way to make amends. The path to redemption wasn't about winning her back. It was about proving that he had changed, that he was no longer the man who had hurt her. David knew that it would take more than words to make things right. He decided to dedicate part of his life to supporting causes that he had once dismissed, particularly those focused on helping underrepresented artists, something that was deeply connected to Mia's work and mission. He reached out to a local nonprofit that supported young women of color pursuing careers in the arts and offered to donate a portion of his earnings to their scholarships. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He wanted to contribute to the community that Mia had once fought so hard to be a part of, to give back in a way that honored her journey. The first step in his redemption came unexpectedly one afternoon when he was invited to a charity gala supporting the same cause. It was a gathering of prominent figures in the art world, and David knew that Mia's name would likely come up. He almost didn't attend, but something inside him told him he had to face this. If he was going to move forward, he couldn't avoid the things that frightened him. When he arrived at the gala, David was immediately struck by how different the world felt now. Gone were the superficial conversations about status or wealth. People were genuinely focused on making a difference, and he found himself in conversations that were meaningful, even if he didn't always have the right words. He wandered the room, scanning the crowd, and finally, at the far end, he saw her, Mia. She was standing near a group of artists, laughing, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked as radiant as ever, her confidence apparent. But there was something different about her now, something that made her seem even more untouchable than before. He knew he wasn't the man she once knew, but he wasn't sure she would ever accept the new version of himself. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach her, unsure if it was even his place to try. But then, as if sensing his presence, Mia turned. She smiled politely, her eyes locking onto his. For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. "Mia," David said softly, stepping forward. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "David, I wanted to apologize again. I know I've said it before, but I need you to know that I'm not the same man I was when I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't want anything from you, but I needed to say it again. For you, for me. I've spent a long time changing, and I hope that you can see that." Mia regarded him quietly, her gaze thoughtful. The air between them was heavy, filled with the years they had lost, the pain they had both endured. Finally, Mia spoke. "I see you, David," she said softly. "I see the work you've put in, and I'm proud of you for that." David's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sadness. He knew this wasn't a moment of reconciliation. Not yet, and maybe never, but it was a moment of understanding. Mia had seen him, truly seen him for the first time in a long while. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but kind. "Thank you for what you're doing now, for supporting the next generation of artists. That's what matters." David nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'll keep doing better. I promise." Mia smiled one last time before turning back to the group of artists. David stood there, watching her go, knowing that this was as it should be. He had no right to ask for more. He had done the work, and that was enough. As the night wore on, David felt a quiet peace settle over him. He had come full circle, from a man driven by insecurities to one who had learned to see others for who they truly were. Mia had been his catalyst for change, and though their paths had diverged, he would forever be grateful for the lessons she had taught him. His redemption arc wasn't about winning her back. It was about becoming the man he could be proud of. As he left the gala that night, David realized that true redemption wasn't about fixing the past. It was about making sure the future was different. And in that, he had found his peace.